let's say I wanted to create a grand myth. A myth so grand it's the myth of myths. It makes all other myths seem wimpy by comparison. And of course, I want to create such a grand myth about William the Conqueror, the King of England, 1066 to 1087. Could I do that? The answer is yes. Question: why? The answer: there are several factors that go into the success of a myth. But one of the prime factors is the amount of elapsed time. Right? A myth can only succeed if enough time has elapsed since the death of the central person of the myth. What is that time? Well, do we have enough time since William the Conqueror? The answer is we do. William the Conqueror died some 933 years ago. Now, 933 years is somewhere between 31 and 37 generations, depending on how long you count a generation is. A generation is anywhere the average time from one person's birth to that person's children's birth. So let's see, one person is born at year X and that person has a child at year Y. The amount of time that elapsed from year X to year Y is a generation. Now, the mean time for a generation is about 25 to 30 years. I'm going to use the smaller time, 25, because it gets more generations in the same amount of time, making it more generous to those who claim that the gospel of Jesus Christ is a myth, and also it is the only number between 25 and 30 that divides evenly into 100. 26, 100 isn't divisible by 26, 27, 28, 29, or 30. In fact, 100 is only divisible by 25, 20, 50, 10, 5, 4, 2, 1, and 100. But most of those numbers are outside of the range. But do you know what is inside of the range? 25. So one generation is 25 years. Using that number, how many generations have passed since the death of William the Conqueror? William the Conqueror died in 1087. Since 25 years is one generation, then 1 century is 4 generations. 900 years, 36 generations gets us to 1987. Another 25 years, 1 generation gets us to 2012. So we are currently 37 37 generations have elapsed since the death of William the Conqueror back in 1087. 37 generations. That is more than enough time to start a myth. In fact, if I started a myth back at around the time that William the Conqueror, back at the earliest possible time, it's very likely that everyone would have believed that myth by now, since it's been nearly 1,000 years simply because it's been over 9 centuries. That's definitely enough time for the myth to spread to nearly every person on Earth. Now, let's say I wanted to start a different myth. I wanted to start the myth to end all myths. A myth that is so great and that all myths look weak and puny in comparison. And I want to create this myth about Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. Could I do such a thing? The answer is yes, even though we have over 814 years later. Okay, Google, when did Queen Victoria die?
Queen Victoria died on January 22nd, 1901. Would you like to hear more?
Fine. Yes.
On the website rmg.co.uk, they say, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81 on the 22nd of January 1901 at 6:30 p.m. She passed away at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her children and grandchildren.
So, Queen Victoria died about 119 years ago. So, how many 4 generations gets us to 2001. In about 6 years, we'll have reached the 2026. So, the amount of generations that have elapsed since Queen Victoria's death is 4. Or almost 5, in fact. But 4 generations. Is 4 generations enough to start a myth about someone? The answer is yes. Let's do another one. Let's say I want to start a myth about Satoshi Tajiri. Can I do that? No, because you see, there is no. Because you see, in order for a myth to occur, there has to be an elapsed number of generations since that person's death. With William the Conqueror, who died nearly 1,000 over 900 years ago, that number of elapsed generations was 37. With Queen Victoria, who died over a century ago, that number of elapsed generations is 4. But with Satoshi Tajiri, who is still alive, the elapsed number of generations is 0. So I currently cannot start a myth about Satoshi Tajiri. What about George Herbert Walker Bush, the former president of the US? Didn't he die about 1 or 2 years ago? The answer is yes, he did die about 1 or 2 years ago, but no, I cannot create a myth about him. Want to know why? Because the amount of elapsed generations, although we round down to the nearest full number, is still 0. We round down is still 0. 0 generations have passed since the death of, George H.W. Bush, and 0 generations is far from enough time. Okay. What if I want to create a myth about Adolf Hitler? Had enough generations elapsed? Well, let me see. With Adolf Hitler, he died 1945, 1950, 1970, 3 generations have elapsed since Hitler's death. Is 3 generations enough in order for a myth to be able to spread? 3 generations since he died. Is that enough time? The answer is yes. There are still some people who are contemporaries of Hitler, but since it's been 3 generations since he died, there's definitely enough time that the majority of people that have ever been contemporaries of Hitler are long dead. So it is significantly easier to start a myth, even though there are still contemporaries of Hitler almost 3 generations after he died. In fact, I think about less than a decade, only about until a couple of years ago, my grandma was one of those people, was born only about 8 years after World War I ended. Was born nearly 20 years before Hitler died. But that's not important since my grandma has died in the 3 generations that have elapsed since Hitler's death. It was a couple years ago. So, since Hitler died 3 generations ago, there is still enough time, elapsed time, in order for me to create a myth about Hitler. Understand that back in the older times, there was less of a chance of surviving 3 generations, so not that many people did it. Still, not that many people do it right now. Well, more people live 3 generations than the amount of people that had a 3 generation long lifespan hundreds of years ago, but still not enough to make my myth fail. It does increase the chance of failing. Now, what else was I done? So, how many generations does it take in order for me to... The answer is 2. You want to start a myth about someone? Well, guess what? That myth won't be able to spread until it's been 2 generations since that person died. With our current day stuff and of increasing life, current day medical science increasing how long someone lives, it's going to start trending on 3 generations, possibly even 4 in the foreseeable future, but generally 2 generations is the minimum. If it's been less than 2 generations since someone died, a myth cannot spread that easily. If it's been less than 2 generations since the death of someone, then the only accounts of that person's life that are going to have an easy time spreading are the accounts that are factually true. Just 2 generations, they're 2 generations or less, there's still going to be, understandably, a lot of contemporaries of that person still alive. The question is, so if the Gospels, the 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really are myths, then what should we expect? We should expect that none of them are come from 2 generations or earlier. Jesus died around and came back to life, so technically he is still alive, but he left Earth about 42 days after he died. This is how it happened. On one day, he died. A couple days later, he came back to life. 40 days after that, he ascended into heaven. So, we're going to use his ascension date into heaven as when the clock starts. Now, given that this is when the clock starts, it happened around 30, 31, 32, 33, we're going to use we want to be as generous as possible to the people that claim that the Gospels are myths, so we're going to use the earliest time, 30 AD. 30 AD, since 1 generation is 25 years, then 2 generations would be 50 years. That would mean it would be impossible for a myth about Jesus Christ to develop and circulate about before the year 80. Now, what do we see? This is Rose Book of Bible Charts, Maps, and Timelines, Rose Publishing. And this is Kyle Davidson Bear's answer to the question of who wrote the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, this guy trends into more of the actual evidence, and this just gives the numbers. So remember, 80. Something can only be mythical if it's after this magic year 80. Anything that is written before this year 80 has been written less than 2 generations after the time that the clock starts, the year 30, the time that Jesus went up into heaven, died. That's the year that Jesus died. The year 30, and anything written before the year 80 was written less than 2 generations after. So, given that it's less than 2 generations after, then it would have been written during a time that there was still a large amount of eyewitnesses and contemporaries alive. Now, Matthew, written in 60. Now, that is just a little bit more than 1 generation after, but still, far too early to be 2 generations. And what do we get from this Kyle Davidson Bear answer on Quora? A personal eyewitness to most of Jesus' ministry. He wrote fairly early in the 40s or 50s, making 60 latest possible estimate. He actually goes into the evidence. I don't have time to do that because my camera will just cut off after a couple minutes, generally about between 20 and 30 minutes. Mark, remember, this is written before 80. So it cannot be mythical. Written too early, too many eyewitnesses still alive who would have still been alive, so it can't be mythical. And what does it say? It says that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he died and came back to life. Right, now, Mark, who wrote this? John Mark, what gospel, where, Rome, when? AD 50s. Kyle Davidson Bear's answer. He recorded the testimony of Peter, a direct eyewitness for most of Jesus' ministry. Mark wrote no later than 64 and likely earlier when it was safer for Peter to lecture publicly in Rome. Now, we know that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in around the year 51. I don't know whether that helps. Maybe it was better for him to preach before, when there were still Jews in Rome, or maybe it was more like because it would have been better, or maybe it was more likely that Mark was written after the Jews left Rome because then it would have probably been safer. I don't know. There's still no later than 64, or he gives a later date than Rowe's book does, and guess what? It's still far too early for it to be a myth. Now, Luke, back to the Rose book, written where in AD 60 to 62. While Luke was not an eyewitness, he conducted extensive research, recording the personal testimonies of many witnesses, including Jesus' mother Mary. Luke wrote no later than 68, 6 years later than the Rose book, and still 12 years too early for it to be a myth. Remember, less than 2 generations after that. Remember, too early, not enough generations have elapsed. There was still too few generations have elapsed, too few years have elapsed, too many eyewitnesses that would have still been alive at this time 28 years later. And Mark, if it's written in the AD 50s, even if it was written before 55, it has the potential to be written in the less than 1 generation had elapsed. So this was written during the second generation, during the first or second generation. This was written during the during the second generation. Now, John, the beloved disciple, the longest living eyewitness of Jesus, wrote his gospel in the 90s, filling his story with the details that the other ones didn't include. where Asia Minor went, AD 85 to 95. Now, this does fall outside of the range, and it is possible that, meaning that it is possible for it to be a myth since it came after the 2-generation period. However, we know that any parts that are in here that are also in here are not mythical, because any detail that's in here that's also in here, here, here is a detail that existed in a book that was written during the too early period when there was still enough eyewitnesses floating around and to basically be living mythbusters. So if a detail is found here but also in here, then that detail is not mythical since the detail is also written in this book, and this book was written too early for it to have mythical content. If a detail that's found in here also appears here, then that specific detail is not mythical since it also appears in here, this book, which was written far too early to contain any mythical content. And if there's a detail that was written in here that is also found here, then that detail is definitely not mythical, as it was also found in this book, which was written far too early to contain any mythical content. So however, if there is a detail that is exclusive to here, then there is a chance that detail is mythical. No, there is just a chance that any detail exclusive to here might be mythical. However, if it is found in if there's a detail that's found in here but found in at least one of any of these three, then said detail is not mythical because it is also found in books that were written too early to be contaminated by mythical details. So there we have it. There are one possibly mythical, but only. So there we have it. There are 3 books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that are definitely 100% not mythical because they were written too early. Not 2 generations since Jesus' death had not yet elapsed until the year 80, and these were all written before 70. So they were written too early to contain mythical content, and it was still less than 2 generations. There would still be a sufficient number of eyewitnesses floating around and to make sure that these books would not have circulated if they were mythical content. However, this book, the exclusive content might be mythical, but the shared content and the content that's in here, but also in any one of these 3 is not mythical since it appears in both here and in stuff that is too early to be mythical. So that is in conclusion. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are definitely not mythical because they came too early. John, maybe, but only on the details that are exclusive to it. And yes, that also means that you can create myths. You could have created a myth about Stalin as early as 2003. In fact, you could have created a myth about Hitler as early as, I think, as early as 1995. So there you have it. These are not mythical. These have all content with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All content definitely not mythical. with John. Shared content that it shares with any of the other three, definitely not mythical. Exclusive content, maybe mythical. That's the conclusion.